We learned last week that this government has cut funding for surgeries.
Right.
Not surprisingly, as a direct result of these cuts, we now see wait times for surgeries getting worse. Since March, when the Sask party cut funding for surgeries, the number of people waiting more than 3 months for their surgery has jumped by 50%. He could have, Mr. Speaker, cut his own government's waste, but instead he chose to cut funding for surgeries. Mr. Speaker, you think you might see a bit more contrition when the Premier's caught right there with the incorrect numbers.
Right.
We had the Health Minister, Mr. Speaker, saying 200 was the waiting list. We had the Premier say 300 to 400, at 400 in this question period, Mr. Speaker, and the reality is 800, only when caught would they admit, Mr. Speaker, that that is the reality. Just since March, and they cut, Mr. Speaker, we have seen a 50% increase for the individuals waiting longer than 3 months. The answers from the Minister, from this government, will be no comfort, Mr. Speaker, to the thousands of Saskatchewan patients who will not be getting their surgeries in a timely way because of this government's cuts to surgeries all across Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we see these shifting answers in this session from the Health Minister and from the Premier. They'll give one answer, then they'll revise it in question period, they'll give a different one in the rotunda, the next day in the House they'll give a different number altogether.
It's extremely disappointing that the Sask party has not been upfront with Saskatchewan people about the true state of affairs with its carbon capture experiment. We learned yesterday that this government captured just 400,000 tons of CO2 last year. That's roughly 40% of its capacity. Something clearly is not right with this project. The minister was too scared to go out into the rotunda to answer media's questions yesterday, so he sent an official. And what that official had to say was very concerning. He gave different answers about when the carbon capture facility might be at full capacity. He said maybe by the end of this year, then he said within the next 6 months, and then he said by the end of 2016. Mr. Speaker, we want to ask this minister, what is going on with this project? When will it finally work at full capacity, and when can we stop hemorrhaging money to Synovus? This government was planning. They were planning on getting about $20 million in revenue from CO2 sales last year. But instead, Saskatchewan families were forced to pay Synovus $12 million. They were going to get $20 million, but they gave away $12 million. Yesterday, Sask Power confirmed that this government is on track to pay Synovus millions and millions more again this year, because this government's carbon capture experiment is still not working even close to capacity. People's power bills have gone up significantly under this government. So when we hear about the Sask party government locking us into a ridiculous contract that has us, the people of Saskatchewan, cutting checks for millions and millions of dollars to an Alberta oil company, that is incredibly disturbing. And it's especially disturbing because Sask Power says they fully expected this to happen. So again, to the minister, why on earth does the Sask party lock us into a deal that they knew it couldn't fulfill?
The Premier said the project was fully operational last October. But we learned this week that the project is still not working properly. After almost 13 months, the project is operating at just 40% capacity, and there are serious design flaws that Sask Power is still scrambling to fix. It's very bizarre to have the Premier of the province saying that the project is fully operational and that it captures, present tense, captures 90% of emissions, when that's not even close to accurate.
Right.
Very telling, Mr. Speaker, that the Premier will not say what he knew and when he knew it in terms of when they were paying Synovus. Also interesting, Mr. Speaker, why they were pumping out news releases saying that they were exceeding expectations when the reality was anything but that, Mr. Speaker. The transparency that we're seeing from this government is offensive. For them to pretend that they have been clear with Saskatchewan people and they have been open about the shortcomings of this project, about the failures with the design, about the huge checks that they have had to stroke, Mr. Speaker, because of their poor contracts that they're in, Mr. Speaker, and the failure to have this project be successful, Mr. Speaker, for the Minister, for the Premier to pretend that they have been transparent by slipping in one sentence in an annual report is offensive to every ratepayer and taxpayer in the province of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. Unbelievable. Mr. Speaker, we are cheering for transparency for Saskatchewan ratepayers. We are cheering, Mr. Speaker, for a project to work, and we are cheering, Mr. Speaker, for the facts so that Saskatchewan people, Mr. Speaker, can exactly know what they are on the hook for. And it sounds like, Mr. Speaker, that the Premier knew exactly what the results were coming out of this plant, Mr. Speaker, and at the same time was allowing news releases to go out that told a very different story.
This government said that this project was exceeding expectations and that it was on target to capture 1 million tons of CO2 in 2015. By April, the Sask Power president admitted in committee that lots of the equipment was being replaced and many components were being redesigned. This week, the Sask Power president said the facility is still being overhauled. So to the minister, what on earth is going on with this project that the redesign, replacement and overhaul has apparently been happening for months?
The Premier has been seriously deflecting and not answering questions. We want to know, when did he know about the design flaws in the project?
Right. Hear, hear.
Yesterday, the Premier continued to say that the carbon capture plant was operating at full capacity on day one, back when he had his big celebration out of Boundary Dam last October. But we need to compare what he said to what the internal documents show. Here's a note from a month and a half after that big grand opening. Quote, "Capture plant has yet to achieve full load." So not once in that month and a half did the plant capture 90% of emissions. Not once. So the question for the Premier is this: should we trust what he says, or should we trust the internal briefing note from Sask Power's head of carbon capture? Mr. Speaker, the Premier's got a lot more explaining to do based on answers like that, when what he is saying is in complete contradiction to what internal documents show time and time again, Mr. Speaker. The Premier's also claiming that he has no idea about serious design flaws with this carbon capture project. This is what he said yesterday, quote, "I didn't know it had fundamental design flaws," end quote. Mr. Speaker, but that doesn't add up one bit, because we know. A briefing note prepared 2 days in advance of the grand opening said the project had, quote, "serious design issues," and, quote, "fundamental design issues," and serious design deficiencies.
When was that?
This was a briefing note 2 days, Mr. Speaker, before the grand opening.
Yep.
Does the Premier of the province of Saskatchewan actually expect us to believe that he never read that briefing note, or that no one bothered to tell him that there were serious design issues with this project? Does he expect us to believe that?
Hear, hear.